Hearthly Stories brings you a true-to-life tale of grief, favoritism, and the exact moment a mother finally stopped choosing family over herself. Stay until the end because what happens in that hospital hallway will stop you cold. My name is Briar Callahan, I am 32 years old, and 4 years ago my daughter Iris was diagnosed with a rare blood disorder that required an experimental treatment not covered by insurance. The total cost came out to $65,000, a number so large it did not even feel real the first time I saw it printed on the estimate. Growing up, Holden had always been the golden child in ways I only fully understood much later. He was 2 years older than me, and from the time we were kids, our parents treated his interests as important and mine as extra. He got private tutoring for the SATs, I was told to figure it out with library books. He got a car for his 18th birthday, I got a card with $50 in it and a note that said we know you will figure something out. You always do. At the time I did not resent it, I told myself that is just how families work sometimes. Someone gets more attention, someone else learns independence. I actually used to be proud of how self-sufficient I had become. I built my whole identity around never needing anything from anyone, which in hindsight was probably exactly what my parents wanted from me. A daughter who would never ask for much because she had already learned not to expect it. I called my parents crying, begging for a loan, anything at all, even $8,000 just to get the process started. My father cleared his throat on the other end of the line and said they simply could not spare a cent right now, that money was tight, that they had their own obligations to think about. My mother chimed in and added that families should not put each other in awkward positions like this. I remember sitting on my kitchen floor after that call ended, the phone still warm in my hand, staring across the room at Iris's crayon drawings taped to the refrigerator, little sunshine yellow houses with crooked blue windows. 6 weeks later my brother Holden announced he was buying a house, a real house, 4 bedrooms, a finished basement, a backyard big enough for a swing set he did not even need yet since he had no children of his own. When I asked how he had managed the down payment, my mother beamed with pride and said Mom and Dad had helped him out, a gift, nothing he would ever need to pay back. The exact same month they had told me they could not spare a cent. I remember standing in my kitchen holding the phone, listening to my mother describe the granite countertops Holden was already planning for the kitchen, the paint colors he and his wife had picked out for the nursery he did not even need yet, and I remember making some small noise of agreement. Congratulations, that is wonderful, because that is what you say, because I still had not fully let myself understand what I was hearing. I did not scream, I did not accuse anyone of anything, I just sat there quietly doing math in my head, the kind of math that turns your stomach completely inside out. I tried everything I could think of after that phone call. I sold my car, I took out a second loan against my house. I set up an online fundraiser that eventually raised $9,500 from complete strangers who did not even know Iris's middle name. It still was not enough. The treatment window closed before I could gather the full amount she needed. I still remember the exact moment the coordinator called to tell me the window had passed. I was standing in the hospital parking lot, and I just sat down right there on the curb, phone pressed to my ear, unable to process the words even as she said them a second time more gently. In those final weeks I remember calling every extended family member I could think of, an aunt in another state, a second cousin I had not spoken to in years, anyone who might be able to spare something. Most did not respond at all, a few sent $50 or $100 with kind messages attached, and I remember being grateful for every single one of those small gestures even as I watched the total climb far too slowly. I remember explaining to Iris, as gently as a 4-year-old can understand something like that Mommy was trying very hard to get her the medicine she needed, and she just nodded and went back to coloring, completely trusting that I would figure it out, because I always had. Iris passed away 5 months after that phone call with my parents, 5 months after my brother signed the papers on his new house with the swing set sitting untouched in the backyard. I stood at her funeral and watched my parents cry real, genuine tears, the kind that make you wonder how 2 completely opposite feelings can exist inside the same people at once: grief for a grandchild they let slip away, and pride for a son they had handed a house to only weeks earlier. The weeks after the funeral are mostly a blur to me now. I remember going through the motions of returning to work far too soon because staying home in that quiet apartment felt unbearable. I remember donating most of Iris's things except for one small box I kept under my bed, her favorite stuffed rabbit, a handful of her drawings, the little dress she wore on her last birthday. I built a wall after that, brick by brick. I still went to holidays because I refused to give anyone the satisfaction of saying I had abandoned the family, but I kept everything and everyone at arm's length from that point forward. Holden, for his part, never once brought up the house or the money. He would just talk casually about his new kitchen island or his home theater setup like none of it had cost anything at all, like it had not, in some indirect but very real way, cost me my daughter. There were entire holiday dinners where I sat across from him watching him talk about paint swatches and patio furniture while I quietly excused myself to the bathroom just to breathe for a minute. No one ever noticed, or if they did, no one ever asked. During those years I became a paralegal, specializing in trust and estate law, which is its own strange kind of irony given everything that came next. I learned exactly how families protect their assets, how they write certain people in and quietly write other people out, how a single clause buried in a document can decide who gets remembered and who gets forgotten entirely. There was something almost meditative about that work in the years after losing Iris, spending my days helping other families organize their wishes clearly, in writing, so there could never be any ambiguity about who mattered and who did not. I sometimes wondered if I was drawn to that field precisely because my own family had never once put anything about me in writing, no promises, no guarantees, nothing but vague comments about tight finances that always seemed to loosen up whenever Holden was involved. I used to draft estate plans for clients who wanted to make absolutely certain their children would never have to wonder where they stood. And I would go home some nights and think about how differently my own life might have looked if my parents had ever once put anything in writing, anything at all, that told me plainly that I mattered just as much as my brother did. Last week, I got a call from my mother at 11 o'clock at night. Her voice was shaking in a way I had not heard since the week of Iris's diagnosis. Holden had collapsed at work, some kind of sudden organ failure the doctors were still struggling to fully explain, and he had been rushed to the hospital. He needed a transplant, and fast, and the donor registry had not yet found a match. The doctor had told them a close biological relative gave the best possible odds. My mother's next words were the ones I will never be able to forget. "You are his sister, Briar. You are the only one who might match." I drove to the hospital that same night, not because I had forgiven anything, but because some small part of me still could not sit at home doing nothing while someone was actively dying, even him. The waiting room was exactly the kind of sterile blue-gray I remembered all too well from Iris's final months. The same uncomfortable chairs, the same overwhelming smell of hand sanitizer and fear hanging in the air. I sat down in one of those chairs for a moment before either of my parents noticed me, and I let myself feel, just for a second, how strange it was to be back in a place like this, a place I had promised myself I would never willingly walk into again. My mother was already there, my father sitting beside her looking somehow smaller than I remembered him being, and when I walked through the doors, my mother stood up so fast her purse slid right off her lap onto the floor. She crossed the room and grabbed both of my hands, clasping them tightly between hers like she was praying, tears already streaming down her face. "Please," she said, "you are the only one who can save him. You have to help us." There was something almost surreal about hearing that word, help, coming from her mouth after everything, as though the concept had only just occurred to her as something families were supposed to offer each other, as though 4 years ago she had not understood the meaning of that same word when I was the one begging. I looked down at her hands wrapped around mine, the same hands that had once told me over the phone that they simply could not spare a cent, and I thought about Iris's small fingers, how they had gone cold in a hospital bed not so different from the one Holden was probably lying in at that very moment. I thought about the swing set nobody had ever used. I thought about those 5 months, how close we had actually been, how even a fraction of what they had given Holden for that down payment would have bought my daughter more time, maybe enough time to make all the difference. I picked my bag up off the floor where I had set it down, slung it over my shoulder, and I said one thing, just a single sentence, calm, quiet, and completely final. My mother's face changed instantly, the color draining out of it like I had physically struck her. My father stood up so fast his chair scraped hard against the tile floor, and right at that exact moment, the doctor stepped out from behind the double doors, clipboard in hand, glancing between the three of us with the practiced neutrality of someone who has delivered 1,000 different kinds of difficult news. He looked directly at me and asked, "So that is a yes, you are willing to be tested as a potential donor?" My mother's eyes went wide and hopeful. still clutching at the empty space where my hands had been only a moment before. I looked at the doctor, then at my father, then back at my mother, and I said the one thing I had actually driven there to say: no, I am not getting tested, I am not a donor candidate, I am here to see my brother, not to save him. The silence that followed felt heavier than almost anything I had ever experienced inside that hospital before, heavier even than the silence after Iris's doctor had once told me the treatment window had officially closed. My mother's mouth opened and closed like she was struggling just to find air. "You do not mean that," she whispered. "He is your brother, he is dying, Briar." I told her calmly that I understood exactly what dying looked like up close, that I had watched it happen to my own child while the people in this family decided a 4-bedroom house mattered more than an experimental treatment. I told her I was not punishing Holden for being sick, but I also was not going to pretend that shared blood erased what had happened 4 years earlier. My father tried a different approach then, the kind of low, reasonable voice he always used when he wanted to sound like the calm, rational one in the room. He said things were complicated back then, that they had financial obligations I simply did not understand. That helping Holden with the house was never meant as a statement against Iris. I asked him one simple question in return: if it truly was not a statement, then why, out of everyone in this entire family, was I the one who got told there was not a cent to spare, while my brother got handed a down payment large enough to buy a 4-bedroom house with a yard he did not even need? Neither of them had an answer for me. I stood there for a moment letting that silence stretch, the same kind of silence they had offered me 4 years earlier when I had asked them for help and received nothing but excuses. It was strange how familiar that silence felt, how it fit so easily back into the shape of every conversation we had ever had about money, about fairness, about who in this family was allowed to need something. The doctor, clearly sensing he had walked into something far larger than a routine consultation, quietly said he would give us a few minutes and stepped back through the double doors. My mother grabbed my arm before I could turn to walk away and asked how I could possibly be so cold, how I could let hatred win out over family. I gently but firmly pulled my arm back and told her this was not hatred at all. Hatred would have meant refusing to show up in the first place. I was there, I told her, and I would sit in that waiting room for as long as Holden needed someone from this family present. I would speak with him if he wanted to talk, but my body, the one thing I still had any real control over in this entire family story, was simply not up for negotiation anymore. I explained as steadily as I could that grief does not just disappear the moment someone else's crisis becomes more urgent than mine was ever allowed to be. Holden's wife came out into the hallway sometime later, having clearly overheard pieces of the argument through the thin door. She looked exhausted and scared, caught somewhere in the middle of a story that had started long before she ever entered this family. She asked me quietly, with no accusation at all in her voice, whether there was anything that might change my mind. I told her the truth, that this was never really about blood type or medical odds in the first place. It was about a family that had taught me exactly how replaceable I was during the exact year my daughter needed them the most. I told her I sincerely hoped Holden found a match, because no one deserves to feel what losing someone feels like, but hope and obligation, I explained, are two very different things. And I was finally done confusing the two of them. She nodded slowly, and instead of arguing with me the way I half expected her to, she simply said she understood, that she had wondered for years why I always seemed so distant at family gatherings but had never felt it was her place to ask. We stood together in that hallway for a few quiet minutes, two women who had both, in different ways, learned exactly how this family handled crisis. Holden did eventually get matched through the donor registry rather than through me, a distant cousin on my father's side who barely knew any of the family history and simply happened to be compatible. He survived the surgery. I visited him once during his recovery, sat quietly by his bed for about 20 minutes, and told him honestly that I was glad he was alive. He apologized softly for never once bringing up the house, for staying silent all those years while our parents built their careful story about financial hardship. It was not everything, but it was something real. And for the first time in 4 years, I finally felt like at least one person in that family truly understood what silence had cost. Before I left his room that day, he asked me quietly if I thought we could ever rebuild something, even a small version of what we used to have. I told him honestly that I did not know, that some things get rebuilt slowly over years and some things simply do not get rebuilt at all, and that either way, I was no longer willing to pretend for the sake of keeping the peace. He said he understood, and for once, I believed him. My parents and I do not talk much these days. Holidays come and go without me at their table now, and I have made a strange kind of peace with that. A peace I honestly did not think was possible even a year ago. I visit Iris's grave every single month, and lately I bring flowers in shades of yellow and blue, the same colors from her old crayon drawings, little sunshine houses with crooked windows, the kind of home she never got the chance to grow up inside of. Some months I sit by her small headstone longer than I mean to, telling her about things that happened that week, the way I imagine I would if she had lived long enough to hear about my day after school. I do not know if that helps her, wherever she is. But it helps me, and I have come to believe that is allowed too. Grief does not always need a destination, sometimes it just needs a place to be spoken out loud. I have learned, slowly and painfully, that family is not simply the people who happen to share your blood, it is the people who actually show up when showing up costs them something real. My parents showed me exactly who they were the month they told me they could not spare a cent, and I finally stopped waiting around for them to become someone else. I still think, some nights, about how differently everything could have gone if they had simply said yes that first time I called, not out of guilt, but because that is just true, and I have made peace with the fact that I will carry that thought for the rest of my life alongside everything else. But I have also learned that carrying grief and choosing yourself are not opposites. You can hold both at once. You can miss what you never got, and still refuse to keep giving pieces of yourself to people who have already shown you exactly how little you meant to them. If this story moved you, if it stayed with you, if it made you think differently about the families we are born into versus the families we eventually choose to hold close, sit with that thought for a moment before you scroll to the next video, because someone watching this right now needed to hear that it is okay to stop giving people access to you simply because you share their last name. Please subscribe to Hearthly Stories for more real, raw stories just like this one. There are so many more voices out there still waiting to be heard, and every single subscription helps make sure one more of them gets told.